Hello and welcome everyone. Thank you very much for tuning in. This is a screencast-o-matic presentation and recording for the part of the lesson that has us looking at China after Mao Zedong and the communist years. Before we get started, please let me encourage you to open up to today's lesson and to scroll down the correct section and get ready to fill in the blanks with the corresponding content that coincides from this presentation. Please also remember that you can replay any part of this presentation for detail, clarity, or repetition later on. Let's go ahead and get started. China after Mao. Consider this question, please. How did China evolve in the years after Mao Zedong's death? Mao Zedong was the communist ruler of China from 1945 to 1976. The Great Leap Forward and the Cultural Revolution were two of Mao's programs that he imposed on China. Now, additionally, the Great Leap Forward was a terrible failure, while the revolution was a success. Both meant tragedy for the Chinese people. These tragedies have had long implications on the Chinese people for many generations. The Great Leap had the goals of improving China's industry and farming specifically. Many elaborate plans were hashed out by the Chinese government during this time. However, implementing them proved to be disastrous for the economy and the people of China. Instead, these programs led to shoddy industry and mass starvation and famine, killing tens of millions of Chinese. Stark pictures show us true testaments of the time inside China. The Cultural Revolution had the goal of strictly imposing Mao's communist beliefs on the Chinese people. The Little Red Book was required reading for all Chinese people to not only read, but also to internalize. The only thoughts and opinions Chinese people were permitted to have were Mao's thoughts and opinions accordingly. Now, additionally, when we look at Mao's years, the Cultural Revolution was successful for Mao because traditional Chinese culture was mostly destroyed, and the Chinese people were under his control. Of course, those who disagreed with Mao, or with communist leaders in charge, or openly criticized Mao and his other henchmen, were beaten, tortured, imprisoned, or killed by Mao's thugs, the Red Guard. Now, as you guys may or may not be aware, during his rule, Mao was responsible for the murders and starvation of over 40 million of his own people. Mao was extremely brutal as a dictator and as a ruler, ruthless and absolutely uncaring for the fate of the Chinese citizens that he sought dominion over. Additionally, it should be understood that Mao was perhaps the deadliest ruler in all of human history. When you look at the carnage of his rule and the extent of the lasting dark legacies that it would leave. The full extent of his crimes against humanity would not be really known until well after his death in 1976, as more transparency placed from the world upon China made it blatantly clear about the realities of his rule. Now, even though Mao had distanced himself from the USSR and began relations with the USA, China remained a nation strictly controlled by communism. Communism, as you guys recall, was the key dominant political and socioeconomic force that drove many of these countries around the world off to the brink of total utopian ideals. These utopian ideals would be met with disastrous realities. Now, in 1976, when Mao did die, and was succeeded by far more moderate communist leaders, the lasting dark legacies of the Mao years soon came, of course, to be at a head. In 1978, Deng Xiaoping took over as ruler of China. Now, he kept communism in place, but began new economic reforms. Some of these reforms are often credited to bringing China up to pace with the rest of the modern world. Deng Xiaoping's economic reforms were called the Four Modernizations. They involved using capitalist ideas to help improve the Chinese economy, and additionally, some of these provisions and proposals helped revolutionize industry and manufacturing specifically. Goal number one was agriculture. Deng ended collective farms and allowed farmers to rent land and grow crops for profit. Keep in mind, under the old system, everything produced was for government and or at a quota price. As a result of farmers having an incentive to work hard, food production increased substantially, in fact by over 50%, as depicted by this graph here. Goal number two was industry. Allowing for private businesses and, of course, relaxing controls over government-run factories, and letting foreign companies actually open in China and invest in China allowed for revitalization of the economy to exist and persist. As a result, incomes rose, Chinese bought consumer goods like TVs and appliances, and more. Goal number three was defense. China created a modernized military, and additionally with military apparatus, they also built more nuclear weapons. Some would say that this nuclear arms race was imminent of the Cold War or post-Cold War years. Goal number 4 was technology. China invested in education, built a space program, and welcomed foreign technological ideas that revolutionized the future of China. Now, these economic reforms did lead to a boom in the overall Chinese economy. In 2010, China passed Japan and became the second biggest economy in the world. This type of growth, of course, might speak volumes about the realities of what capitalism can provide a country, but it should be noted here that the stark contrast between capitalism and communism might lead to this type of trend that you see on this graph. And this graph as well. It shouldn't be understated, though, that the lives of Chinese people did improve, although not for everybody. Deng's reforms had unintended consequences for Chinese society, and moreover, you can see a bounce and blend of both Eastern and Western culture and economics when going to China today. For example, China's emphasis on education and the influx of Western companies led many Chinese to learn more about democracy. They began to question their lack of personal freedoms in China, and it became blatantly clear that they were not necessarily at par with other countries. So thousands of Chinese students did demand democracy from their government and protested in Beijing's Tiananmen Square in 1989. You might have heard of these protests before or seen iconic pictures and images. Now, additionally, these pictures are testaments of the growing resentments of post-Mao years, but also, of course, against the dark legacies of communism. Student leader Wang Dan in Tiananmen Square called for a citywide march. Of course, how do you think the Chinese government reacted to this demonstration? Probably not so positively. And given what we know about China today, and their lack of course, openness and transparency with communication and free speech. Chinese soldiers and tanks attacked the crowd, killing hundreds of protesters. The Chinese government arrested and executed leaders of the protest as well. And this type of photo and video was in fact displayed to the world. The horrible carnage of such said events that came from this directly and also inadvertently are testaments of the dark legacies of communism and also the lack of free speech and transparency in China. Moreover, these pictures also show us and tell us the dissent that was growing at rapid numbers within China. Onlookers here can be seen looking at the carnage and dead bodies. Additionally, one can only imagine what it must have been like to have been part of these demonstrations and to internalize what these events really meant. An estimated 5,000 were killed and 30,000 were wounded. You can check this link out later that's going to be included on the Google Classroom portal for more about this specific protest. The Communist Party increased control over citizens by repressing pro-democracy demands, censoring the media and information, and restricting freedom of speech. Some of these elements of government rule and, of course, close censorship can be found in China's Great Firewall today. In 1997, Great Britain returned Hong Kong to China after ruling the colony for 155 years. It should be noted that Hong Kong, as depicted here, has proved to be a trip point for China, as there are many oddities here between people of Hong Kong and China today, both in their value systems and economies. In 1997, Great Britain not only returned Hong Kong to China, but they additionally had a changing of the guard, so to speak, as far as rulership and ruling styles. Under British and Chinese control, Hong Kong served as one of the world's major commercial and financial centers, and it was a great prime location for seaport trading. Additionally, it should be noted here that Hong Kong today has many different types of democratic ideals that might mimic and mirror the US. Now, to be clear, China has one of the fastest growing economies in the world. Others include Brazil, India, Russia, and more. We shouldn't underestimate the role of China's economy today, as they do in fact produce a lot of goods, products, and services. These charts here demonstrate the rising tide of Chinese influence on our economy. But China has a low-wage workforce, large gap between the rich and the poor, few personal freedoms, and human rights violations left and right. It's pretty clear to see that some of these types of implications will prove to be tough to overcome. More information can be found on the Google Classroom portal about China today, and other parts and tenets of our lesson will hope to focus on that. As you guys can see here, the story of China is still not over, as events related to the COVID-19 and also, of course, the coronavirus are still ongoing, and other issues too with censorship, freedom, the air of mystery around President Xi, and several other aspects too of Chinese life from the environment to foreign relations with other nearby countries as well. Only time will tell what type of country China will be in our growing world. Thank you very much for tuning in, and good luck with completing the rest of the lesson.